House to speak on behalf of the great people of Toronto Centre. And in particular, today's debate is around Bill 131, the government bill entitled Transportation for the Future Act. When it comes to public transit, Speaker, I have a very personal and deep relationship to this critical piece of infrastructure in the city of Toronto, this essential service that my family and I have used for my entire life in Canada. My entire time in Toronto. My parents never had a car. They never had a driver's license in this city. And I was the first person in my family, believe it or not, Speaker. This might be a very challenging story for those folks in the House to comprehend, but I was the first person in my family to actually get my driver's license here. And so for the majority of my life, right up until being a young adult, if the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, if it didn't take us there, meaning it didn't travel there or the route wasn't covered, we simply didn't go. And that meant that my mom, my dad, my grandmother, and 3 children would all pile onto a streetcar or a bus and the subway if we were to make any journey as a family. Imagine that being difficult for newcomers, especially with young children, kids who didn't always listen, who were always being sort of pulled around. And so that was very, very difficult. So I am deeply invested in the quality of public transportation, quality of public transit in Toronto, but also recognizing my experience is not so uncommon. For many people, don't necessarily have access to a vehicle. And if some families do have access to a vehicle, you may have 5 or 6 people who need to go in many different routes. Someone in the family is reliant on public transit. So this bill is actually very important, especially as we talk about the future of transit in Ontario. And I want to be able to support the spirit of the bill, because I think that's important. But as we dig deeper into this bill, things start to unravel, and it unravels very quickly. So I'm very pleased to be able to provide some thoughts and some feedback with members of this House. Transit riders in Ontario have been waiting at stations as well as bus stops for far too long. We have seen advocacy groups like those in the City of Toronto called TTC Riders, who have been calling for fare integration for literally years and beyond that, decades. And so I'm very happy to know that this government is listening, as previous governments have said that they are very interested in fare integration. So this is a long time coming. And fare integration, of course, will reduce expenses for transit users, especially those who have the furthest to travel. And like you and many who are still using transit, I don't want to necessarily spend my time calculating how much my trip will cost. I just want to be able to go in and tap. And so with the rising costs of gas, insurance, and maintenance, fare integration and the reduction of fares overall is actually going to be welcome. But we're not talking about the reduction of fares. We're simply talking about fare integration. At the same time, the cost of operating transit is on the rise. So let's not forget that the government has refused to continue the previous Liberal government's commitment to at least even reducing Go Riders' fare by $1.50 in 2020. This government scrapped that. There was another short-lived fare integration project that predates this one, and this is where Torontonians were asked to pay an extra $60 a month for a little sticker that we would have attached on the back of our monthly Metro Pass, and that would allow us to ride the GO system within Toronto. While those measures may have been well-intentioned, they never really did meet its obligations, and that also was a problem as it hurt thousands and tens of thousands of Ontarians trying to get through their daily commute. I worry about the fate of our small businesses in the downtown as more and more people are now working from home. And they don't oftentimes go out to buy their lunches or perhaps do their local shopping while they're here. And so workers have obviously created their own schedules, and they do this oftentimes in collaboration with their employers. But I would hate to think that small businesses who are actually reliant on the reliability to connectivity of transit in order to move shoppers and diners through the city. If you don't have a reliable transit system that is going to be properly maintained and staffed, you also see the decline in the struggle of small business. And of course, we saw that during the pandemic, and many of the businesses in the core of the city have said they are still not up to the sale and revenues of where they needed to be before the pandemic. And we know that many businesses in Ontario are still covered in debt. The average small business debt these days is $134,000. So when we build transit, good, reliable transit, it's going to foster and help our economy. Not only are we moving goods and services along when we build good roads, a connected highway system, but transit actually allows us to move people along, which then drives the economy as well. So those are good, definitely good obtainable goals that we should all be striving for. But if the transit isn't there, it's not going to be helpful. Let me share with you, Speaker, an experience that I have had sitting at City Council, Toronto City Council. And it was the first of many experiences that we have at City Council. On the first day of Mayor and then Mayor Rob Ford's tenure, he stood up at City Council and he tore up Transit City, which was an $8.15 billion LRT plan, which covered 120 kilometers across the city, over 7 LRT lines. Shovels were already in the ground. Shovels had to be put down. Contracts that were signed up to $1.3 billion were then torn up, and everybody was frozen. They didn't really know what to do. 150 Transit City staff were told to stop working. $130 million that was already spent was gone, with another $65 million of sunk costs that we would never recover. We have a legacy here where we have conservative politicians coming into Toronto, ripping up our transit plan. In 1995, Mike Harris did the same thing. He came into power with the common sense revolution. Very shortly afterwards, he actually said no and tore up 2 significant projects that were underway. One of them was the Eglinton West line. A couple of years later, he began the most horrific impact to the TTC that generations afterwards we're still living with. And that's when he cut the operational funding and the subsidies to transit in Toronto. To this point, to this day and time now, the transit system in Toronto is one of the least funded, regionally, provincially, statewide funded transit system in North America. What a horrible title that we hold there, Speaker, but yet we are living with the legacy, unfortunately, with conservative politicians constantly meddling in the affairs of City Council and, in this case, with the transit plans that the city had already put underway. But they're not alone, Speaker. They were supported. In this case, with Mayor Ford at that time, he was supported by the Liberals at Queen's Park as well as the Liberals in Ottawa. And what we saw there was if the Liberal government of the day here said no to the mayor, you shouldn't be tearing up a transit plan, you should build what's already underway, finish the LRT system, Toronto would be moving faster today than it ever would be, because that's what would have happened. So we have now 2 significant factors that cannot be ignored, where we have conservatives and liberals constantly working together in partnership to undermine local transit planning as well as local transit construction. So now we have the Premier who took a crayon and he decided to redraw the downtown relief line. And when he did that, he moved stations around and then dropped stations without any consultation, without any technical review or design. So we are now building the Ontario line, or you're building the Ontario line, and it's creating a little bit of chaos and a lot of confusion, largely because we are watching the Eglinton Crosstown fiasco unfold. And I would say it's a fiasco. You can ask the residents and the business owners along Eglinton on how that line has served them over the past 13 years while it's been under construction, as billions of dollars have ballooned in terms of overrun, and with no opening date in the horizon, there's lots of cause of concern on whether or not this will actually work well for the local residents. Speaker, the other thing I want to point to your attention is that we actually had, a Mayor, John Tory, who actually created a new transit plan called Smart Track. And largely everyone will agree that that Smart Track cinched him the 2014 victory. And, 10 years later, Smart Track is nowhere to be found. It's a shadow of itself. And the project went from 22 stations under the Transit City banner to about 5 stations, and who knows if they're going to actually actually be realized. And we have a city that's growing, bursting at the seam. The project has dragged on, as projects sometimes do, when you don't have core funding and it's not properly vetted, and if it's not properly acknowledged by all parties, and you have it now left sort of floating again in the wind. So it's not, it's not that Torontonians in particular, don't rely on transit. I just told you my personal story. Without a transit system that's well funded and properly operating, my goodness, my family wouldn't be able to get to work. And and both my parents worked. I hardly saw them because they worked so darn hard. And everybody else who doesn't have a car is relying on transit. So that's why the stakes are so incredibly high. And so, we now have a new mayor in Toronto who is now deeply committed to public transit. Her first few political acts in the city of Toronto have already shown us that she's going to be reversing service cuts. She's going to be putting money back into transit where she can. But Mayor Chow and Toronto City Council can't do any of that work on their own. None of that can be done without actual government support here. So, and that's what brings me to Bill 31, to Bill 131, and why I think we need to be able to move through this very carefully. Cities need to build transit in partnership with the province. That is non-refutable. But when you defer those costs and you download the responsibilities to cities, and you talk about building transit for the future when you can't even get transit done today, there isn't going to be a lot of trust. So we know that through Bill 23, cities are going to lose about $1 billion already in Ontario. And so we're also seeing an economic real estate slowdown. Every developer that I speak to, especially in the busiest part of the country in Toronto Centre, they tell me it's coming. So when you have a bill that's largely structured that talks about attracting development and levies to build the transit that government should be building, you're walking into a timeline right now that is not going to be proven to have a good outcome. Nothing is going to be built, especially when you have developers who are already very nervous, as they all are right now, about the future of construction, the future of the housing sector, because of high interest rates, because of high labor costs, because of disruption in supply chain. All of that is before us, and you're putting forward a piece of legislation that has very little details, that doesn't say anything with respect to how you're going to operationalize it. It's very vague on how you're going to fund it, except for that some developer, some private sector partnership with the municipality is going to build it for you. It makes no sense. And developers will tell you, because it's been tried before in the city of Toronto, many conservative politicians have said the development industry will build you transit. They will tell you they are not going to do it. Every single one of them will tell you that transit is provincial city responsibility, is federal responsibility. You build it, we come to build the housing. That's what they'll tell you. And so this strategy, this legislation as laid out, is not going to be producing the transit that you think it will, because it's not going to work. It has been promised over and over again, and it has never, ever really built a network of connected, reliable, affordable, well-operationalized transit. So it's clear to me that the government's actions are going to create that condition where municipalities are backed into a corner, and that corner is they're starved for transit. They haven't really had working partners in the provincial government that will sit down with them on a regular basis, take a look at their expansion plans and how they want to grow up their neighborhoods, grow up their cities. And they haven't had that mutual relationship and constant, back and forth feedback loop where everyone is working together. It's always my plan or your plan. And, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to withhold funding. If you will take up my plan, I might give you a little bit of funding, but you have to come up with more on your own. This is why we have gridlock, and that's why we are struggling in Ontario right now as we see transit starts and stops, transit plans drawn up and ripped up constantly. I want to join the members of ATU Local 113, the hardworking men and women who actually run Toronto's transit system, in sharing their concerns that this bill could have very significant implications to how they operate the system, the largest transit system in Canada, and they haven't been consulted. They haven't been asked to come to the table to work with the government to resolve some of these big loophole questions. And so you put forward a bill that's going to impact 113 and the transit workers who are deeply committed to keeping Toronto running, but you haven't talked to them. And that, of course, is a big, big problem. And we know that you and I are not going to operate those trains, those buses and streetcars, so you got to talk to them, and that needs to happen as soon as possible. And if it interferes, if Bill 113 interferes with collective bargaining rights or their collective agreements, then you better bet that we will oppose it every step of the way, because we are not going to allow anything that will actually upend their collective agreements. And the courts will not let you either. Bill 113 also requires municipalities to negotiate with developers when it comes to the construction of the GO stations. I have shared with you that doesn't work. And I'll tell you that if you think you're going to be building housing on the Greenbelt and that's going to be highly desirable and it's not going to further urban sprawl, there isn't a single piece of construction of transit that's going to connect those new homes that should be built elsewhere, especially on lands that are already approved, that are already within our urban municipal boundaries. Any reliance on development charges or any type of levies is really tipping into that P3 partnership. Of course, PP3 partnerships have been proven to be an utter disaster for public coffers, for public decision makers, and ultimately the public taxpayer. They are always much more expensive. They never finish on time. They're always a disaster. We have so many examples to point to, and they don't necessarily need to be transit. It could be hospitals. It could be other type of public buildings. They're all stuck in the same boat when you're trying to contract out your risk and you think that somebody's going to do it for you without the profit structure. That's just not possible. That's not how capitalism works. And they're not doing it because of benevolency. What we've also seen with the government's transit agency, who's tasked with building transit in Ontario, is that they've been mired in secrecy. I've experienced that. The good member of Toronto, Danforth, has experienced that when we had political staff in the Minister of Transportation's office direct them to actually exclude us from notification. Take the names of the member of Toronto Centre, the member of Toronto Danforth, off the notification. That was revealed in the Toronto Star article. When I tried to ask some questions, it was shut down. When I tried to FOI this information, I was given a very long list of costs. And, it was very hard. And I am a public office holder, and I have every right to have that information because a public agency is tearing down 21 trees in my community. It happened on a bitterly cold Wednesday weekend and without any notice to my community, which is an absolute disrespect there. We are now seeing Metrolinx and the Eglinton fiasco unfold even further. It is an absolute joke. It really is a painful point and pressure point in the city, as it actually has created so much additional gridlock and with no end in sight, and the costs continue to balloon. And when we ask for accountability, we're told that it's almost like it's not really ours to ask for. Well, it is. It is every Ontarian's right to know what's happening with those billions of dollars being spent, with no service being offered, with no infrastructure coming online that we are aware of. And of course, we want it to be safe, but we're not getting the answers without tooth and nail fight. So, Madam Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity for speaking to this bill. I'll look forward to any questions that come forward, and it's been an honor to speak to this House.
Now time for questions. I recognize the member for Lanark Frontenac Kingston.
And thank you for the comments regarding Bill 131. Municipalities have expressed an interest in this strategy, and we heard from the member from Whitby about the positive feedback from the Mayor of Clarington and the region of Durham. I'm just wondering, she talked about the reliance on transit. In my area, Lanark County, there is no transit. You either have a car or you don't have transportation. What this bill facilitates is the expansion of transit to people who don't have it. And so I'm wondering why the member would not support something that expands and gives people something that she already has.
Back to the member from Toronto Centre.
Speaker, and thank you to the member across for the question. I absolutely do support the expansion of transit, especially transit that's well studied, transit that should connect communities to where they need to go on a daily basis, and transit that is funded, not just capital costs up front, but with provincial dollars for operating and that's sustained into the future. Without all of that coming together, the transit that's being talked about in this bill, that's being referenced in this bill, will actually not come to fruition. And that's why I have trouble with this bill, because I want your community to have the public transit it deserves, and this bill is not going to deliver it.
Further questions? I recognize the member for London North Centre.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Toronto Centre for her presentation today. Earlier in the chamber, I've been talking about the cancellation of GO service to the London area. My constituents have reached out to me and said that it was a plan that was set up to fail from the start. It was an 8-hour round trip from London to Toronto, and many have called it, half-baked plan. My question to the member, though, in terms of what's missing from this bill, would the member like to see Metrolinx being made more accountable and more transparent to the public? And would the member like to see increased municipal participation on Metrolinx boards?
Response, back to the member from Toronto Centre.
Yes, thank you very much to the member from London West. Thank you for that very important question. Absolutely, Torontonians want further accountability, stronger accountability, more accountability from the provincial transit body. If anything, it's actually been written about in most major newspapers in Toronto. Most transportation transit journalists covering the issue is that Metrolinx is not accountable to the people that they are supposed to be serving, the people that they're supposed to be building transit on. And in the city of Toronto, things are happening to us and not with us, especially when it comes to transit. Thank you.
Further questions? I recognize the member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Toronto Centre for her comments in the House today. No one would know better than the member for Toronto Centre about the viability of transit in the City of Toronto. This is where I have always taken transit, to be honest, and experiencing the subway. I do appreciate the integration that I get to have coming from the train and onto the subway. I've actually never had the chance to use GO Transit, so I wanted to understand a little bit more about the parts of the Act that speak to the integration of the systems, basically the City of Toronto Act amendments. It seems to be a way that to make the system work a bit better together, would unify the systems to make riders get to from point A to point B with more ease. I'm wondering if you have opposition to that component of it.
Back to the member for response.
Thank Thank you very much to the member for the question. I am a firm supporter of transit integration, especially as we have people who are coming from further and further outside the core of the city to come into work. We rely on those individuals, those commuters, to come and actually fill up our office towers. We rely on them to actually help build this economy. And to me, it's all about one Ontario, to be quite honest. And one Southern Ontario is how we're competing region to region. So fair integration is absolutely critical in order for us to have a successful, well-connected transit system that's reliable. But we also need to make sure that we work with our labor partners. We need to work with the men and women who actually provide the transit service itself, that they're at the table. And I hope to see that in the coming days, even if there's an amendment to this bill or if there's an announcement saying that you're going to start talking to ATU 113. So anytime we can support transit integration and do it well, I am definitely with you. Thank you.
Further questions? I recognize the member for Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you, Speaker. I do want to recognize my seatmate and colleague for her incredible knowledge of municipal affairs and infrastructure. The first question that came from the government side was sort of that energy of, how dare you not be in extremely gushing support of this? How dare you even question this? And so my question to her is, having that background, that expertise, and that experience at City Hall, can you think of any reasons, if there are any members of this Conservative government that might have a legacy that go back to City Hall and their effects on transit, namely putting transit possibly into disarray there and with delays and all sorts of changes of projects, can you explain why we might have misgivings whenever they put forth anything to change transit in the province of Ontario?
Back to the member for Toronto Centre.
Thank you very much to my colleague and seatmate for that question. I don't want to be struck out of order, but we have the Premier here with his brother at City Council at that time in 2010, where we saw Transit City, a 120-kilometer fully funded 22-station stop torn up. And as I mentioned, this was a project that had $130 million of funding already spent, $65 additional million of sunk costs that we were never able to recover, and not to mention a decade of planning. So yes, when new plans and new strategies are come up without actual consultation and deep engagement with municipalities or the transit workers, there is going to be cause for concern, because that has been the history that we've had with the Premier. Thank you.
Further questions? I recognize the member for Brampton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for her speech. Madam Speaker, this legislation has overwhelming support from municipalities, and as the member from Whitby was highlighting, that the transit integration, that was a thing that was demanded from the municipalities from long time, and through this legislation we are delivering on that. Madam Speaker, the opposition members continues to deliver false talking points to justify why they're not supporting transit expansion. So my question to the member opposite is, how will her members of the community will benefit from transit integration, and will she be supporting this legislation?
Back to the member for Toronto Centre.
Yeah, thank you very much, Speaker. I'm pretty confident that throughout this entire debate, every member on the opposition benches stood up and spoke in favor of fair integration. We all spoke about the need to make sure that we have a seamless system of payment that is reliable and, quite honestly, convenient for the user. That's how we get people back onto transit. But the bill is not just one schedule, is it? The bill has two schedules. The bill has two schedules, and the second schedule, I think, is worth digging into and exploring, because that is the section of the bill that I will challenge you, and I will challenge any member of this House to give me an economic study that will tell me and everybody else in Ontario that you can have the private sector pay for transit exclusively without you putting in any money. It's just not going to happen.
Further questions? I recognize the member for Scarborough Southwest.
Very much, Speaker. I also want to take a moment to thank my colleague and friend from Toronto Centre for her very informative remarks, because I know she cares deeply about transit across this city and this province, and has done a lot of work as a councillor before to make sure that we have transit that is integrated, that serves the people. And one of the things that we've always had difficulty with, Speaker, which provincial governments repeatedly failed, was providing the operating funding. And the answer that you were just giving, I think there's more to carry forward on that topic as well, because We have seen governments fail to provide the operational funding necessary for the TTC. And look at where we are right now. I'm in Scarborough. We have a horrible system where people need to wait for 45 minutes to an hour sometimes to get on the bus. Yep. So I would like to hear from the member about what he thinks could have been in this bill, but also in terms of Schedule 2, how this will actually deteriorate when it comes to the services that we need in our transit system.
Final response back to the member from Toronto Centre.
Thank you very much for that very important question. And to the family, to all the families living in Scarborough, quite honestly, my heart really feels for you, because you have been shortchanged when it comes to transit, and transit expansion has been very slow to non-existent in Scarborough. The service there is just shameful asking families to wait 30 minutes, 20 minutes, and sometimes longer in snowstorms when they are just trying to get home or trying to get to their second or third jobs to sort of feed their families. What we see in this bill is some troubling outcomes, Madam Speaker, and the troubling outcome is that it doesn't actually talk about supporting the construction and the funding of transit through this House, this order of government which has the most responsibility when it comes to regional transit, this government that actually has the most responsibility.
That is all the time we have for questions and answers. It is now time for further debate. I recognize the member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the Scarborough Agincourt MPP, it is my honor to stand in this august chamber to speak on Bill 131, Transportation for Future Act 2023. Our government is taking action to build Ontario by introducing the Transportation for Future Act 2023 that, if passed, would help build more GO transit stations, support housing around transit, and make it more affordable and convenient to travel across the greater Golden Horseshoe, helping families save money while also increasing ridership. The proposed legislation would create a new and voluntary funding tool for municipalities that will help spur the construction of new GO transit station, accelerating transit expansion while building vibrant mixed-use communities and much-needed housing. This new tool, called the Station Contribution Fee, would ensure that the developers and landowners contribute to the cost of new GO transit stations when building new residential and commercial developments within a specific distance of these stations. This would help speed up the construction of new GO transit stations while also creating new and affordable housing and mixed-use communities around these stations. Station contribution fee will also help to facilitate earlier GO station construction by spreading the cost of delivering the stations across multiple developments and over multiple years. New stations will also spur new development and new housing. The legislation, if passed, is also proposing technical changes that will provide the City of Toronto with the tools to better integrate its transit service with other regional transit networks. By taking these critical steps, our government is strengthening communities, supporting economic growth, creating more jobs, delivering better services, and improving the lives of Ontarians today and for generations to come. As a resident of Scarborough Agincourt for the past 33 years, I can attest that such infrastructure plans as Bill 131, if passed, are much needed and instrumental to our residents. Large numbers of newcomers settle in Scarborough Agincourt and Scarborough. It is forecasted that in the next few years, the population of Scarborough will increase by more than 100,000 residents. Furthermore, Our government is opening a medical school in Scarborough, and many educational institutions, such as the University of Toronto and Centennial College, are expanding their Scarborough facilities to accommodate the increased enrollment requests. In addition, many businesses are investing in Scarborough by expanding their operations and building new facilities. The forecasted economic and population growth will require reliable public transportation for the residents to commute to work, send their children to school, attend to daily chores, and keep connected with their society and social activities. This bill, if passed, will address Scarborough Agincourt and the Scarborough residents' vital needs and provide them the quality of life they aspire. For a long time, Scarborough residents have been ignored and marginalized. Not anymore. Scarborough has become the focus of our government attention. The mistakes of the past are being addressed. One project that will greatly benefit the residents of Scarborough is the Scarborough Subway Extension, a 7.8-kilometer extension of TTC Line to Bloor-Danforth Subway from the existing Kennedy Station northwest to McCowan Road, Shepherd Avenue. The line will include 3 new stations at Lawrence Avenue and McCowan Road, Scarborough Center, and Terminal Station at McCowan Road and Shepherd Avenue. In addition, the commitment of our government to extend the Shepherd East subway line from Fairview Mall to McCowan Road is one of the forecasted transit plans for Scarborough. Our government has already allocated the financial resources